The town of Red Creek thought they were signing 2 death warrants. They dumped a shattered, paralyzed mountain man on the porch of a heavy, exhausted widow, expecting the brutal winter to swallow them both. It was a cruel joke, a cheap way to run her off her land. But folks out west always underestimate what happens when 2 discarded things decide they're done bleeding for the amusement of others. This is the story of Martha and Colum. The August heat in Red Creek didn't just bake the earth, it wrung it out. Martha Higgins stood over the washboard, her thick arms plunging a faded flannel shirt into the grey, lye-thickened water. Sweat gathered in the deep crease of her neck and pooled beneath her heavy breasts, soaking the front of her calico dress until it clung to her stomach. She hated the heat. She hated the smell of boiled dirt and cheap soap. Most of all, she hated the sound of Amos Higgins' wagon rattling up her drive. Amos was her late husband's brother, a man who wore his cruelty like a Sunday suit. He pulled the mules to a halt, the iron rims of the wheels grinding into the dry dust. Amos spat a stream of black tobacco juice over the side, missing Martha's meagre patch of radishes by an inch. "Brought you a present, Martha." Amos called out, his voice scraping like a rusty hinge. Martha didn't stop scrubbing. Her broad shoulders worked in a steady, punishing rhythm. "I ain't got the coin for whatever you're peddling, Amos, and I ain't selling the farm." "Ain't selling nothing." Amos chuckled a wet, phlegmy sound. He climbed down from the buckboard, his boots kicking up little clouds of alkali dust. "The town council had a meeting. Decided since you're so lonely out here and so capable of bearing weight, you could do a Christian service." Martha finally paused, wiping a sudsy hand across her forehead, leaving a streak of wet hair plastered to her temple. She walked heavily toward the wagon, her knees aching with every step. When she peered over the wooden sideboards, her stomach dropped. Lying in a bed of soiled, foul-smelling straw was a man, or what was left of one. He was massive, even crumpled up. His legs were bound in crude, dirty splints made of scavenged pine boards. A rough wool blanket covered his waist, stained dark with dried blood and urine. His hair was a matted tangle of grease and dirt, hiding most of his face, but his eyes were visible. They were the pale, washed-out blue of winter ice, and they were staring right at her. There was no fear in them, only a feral, burning humiliation. "Bear got him up on the ridge," Amos offered, leaning against the wheel. "Crushed his spine. Doc says he's dead from the waist down. Can't walk, can't work. Town ain't paying to feed a useless cripple, and the poorhouse is full. Figure you need a man around the place, Martha. Even half a man." Amos laughed, a sound that made Martha want to take the heavy wooden washboard and crack it over his skull. It was a joke. The whole town was in on it. Give the fat, stubborn widow the paralyzed mountain man. Let them starve together. It would save the bank the trouble of foreclosing. She looked back at the man in the wagon. The stench rolling off him was staggering, rotting meat, old sweat, and infection. He breathed in shallow, ragged gasps. "I can't take him!" "Amos." Martha said, her voice flat, devoid of the tears Amos was hoping for. "I can barely feed myself." "Take him, or I dump him in the ditch," Amos replied, his smile vanishing. "Council's orders. He's your ward now." Without waiting for her to argue, Amos unlatched the tailgate. He grabbed the man by the shoulders of his ragged buckskin coat and hauled him backward. The man didn't cry out, but a sharp, guttural grunt ripped from his throat as his ruined legs scraped against the wood. Amos let go, and the mountain man hit the dirt with a heavy, sickening thud. Dust plumed around him. Amos tipped his hat. "Enjoy the company, Martha." She stood frozen, the harsh sun beating down on her back as the wagon rattled away, leaving her alone with a crippled stranger in the dirt. The silence of the plains rushed back in, broken only by the buzzing of horseflies zeroing in on the man's bloody splints. Martha looked down at him. He was trying to push himself up on his elbows, his massive forearms corded with strain, but his lower half remained utterly limp, a dead anchor pinning him to the earth. He collapsed back into the dust, his chest heaving, refusing to look at her. She felt a bitter, ugly wave of resentment. She wanted to walk inside, lock the door, and let the coyotes have him. She was tired. She was so damn tired of taking care of things that were dying. Her husband, her crops, her dignity. But she looked at the heavy set of his jaw, the white-knuckle grip of his hands in the dirt, and recognized the shape of his pride. It looked exactly like her own. "I ain't dragging you," she said, her voice rough. The man grunted. "Didn't ask you to." His voice was a gravelly rasp, dry as a riverbed. "Well, you ain't dying in my yard. It'll ruin the grass." Martha walked over her heavy thighs, brushing together. She bent down, ignoring the protest of her lower back. She grabbed him under the armpits. His coat was stiff with old grease. "Grab my arms," she ordered. He hesitated, then his large, calloused hands clamped onto her forearms. His grip was shocking in its strength. Martha planted her boots, braced her thick core, and pulled. He was incredibly heavy, a dead weight of bone and muscle. She dragged him backward, step by agonizing step, toward the porch. Sweat poured into her eyes, stinging them. Her breath came in harsh huffs. They made it to the porch steps. She dropped him for a moment, resting her hands on her knees, gasping. He lay on the wooden boards, panting just as hard and staring up at the peeling paint of her ceiling. "Name's Martha," she wheezed. "Colum," he grunted, closing his eyes. She didn't offer a welcoming smile. He didn't offer gratitude. There was only the heat, the flies, and the brutal reality of the timber and flesh they now had to manage. Martha grabbed him under the arms again, hauling him over the threshold. The first 3 days were a masterclass in misery. Martha moved Colum into the small parlor, putting him on a narrow iron cot she dragged down from the attic. The room quickly took on the smell of pine needles, fever sweat, and the sharp ammonia tang of soiled linens. Taking care of him was an intimate, ugly business completely stripped of any bedside romance. There was nothing noble about it. When he needed to be cleaned, he would stare fixedly at a crack in the ceiling, his jaw locked so tight the muscles twitched, while Martha grimly did the work with a rag and a bucket of cold water. She wasn't gentle. She didn't have the time or the energy to be delicate. She rolled his heavy, useless torso over with a grunt, her thick fingers gripping his hips tightly to keep him from sliding off the narrow mattress. He hated it. He hated the indignity, the helplessness, and most of all, he hated that it was her doing it. "You're pulling the skin," he snapped one Tuesday morning, his voice low and vibrating with repressed rage. Martha dropped the wet rag into the tin bucket with a loud splash. "Then grow a new pair of legs and wash yourself, mountain man. Until then, you take the lye soap and you keep your mouth shut." Colum glared at her. His eyes, now unclouded by the fever that had broken the night before, were fierce and tracking. He watched her constantly. He watched the way she moved heavy but surprisingly light on her feet. He watched the way she ate her meager portion of cornmeal mush, scraping the bottom of the tin plate to get every last grain. He noticed the fraying hem of her dress and the bruised bags under her eyes. He expected pity. In the mountains, if a wolf broke its back, the pack left it. Down here, the townspeople looked at the crippled with a sickening mix of pity and disgust, patting their own pockets in relief. But Martha didn't pity him. She looked at him with the exact same tired annoyance she gave the rusted water pump out, back when it required an extra hard crank to draw water. To her, he was just another broken thing on a broken farm that required sweat to manage. The turning point happened on the 4th evening. A fierce summer storm had rolled in, the thunder rattling the thin, poorly glazed window panes. Martha had spent the entire day patching the roof of the chicken coop. She came inside, soaked to the bone, muddy and exhausted. Her hair was plastered to her round face, and she smelled faintly of wet feathers and damp earth. She collapsed into the wooden rocking chair by the stove, peeling off her mud-caked boots with a heavy groan. She didn't even look at Colm. She just sat there, rubbing her thick, aching thighs, her head thrown back, eyes closed. Colm lay on the cot. His throat was parched. On the small stool beside him rested a tin cup of water Martha had left hours ago. He was tired of asking for things. He was tired of waiting for her. He shifted his upper body, ignoring the sharp jolt of phantom pain that shot down his dead spine. He reached out his thick, scarred fingers, straining towards the stool. His fingertips brushed the rim of the cup. He stretched further his chest, lifting off the mattress. But his balance was gone without the anchor of his legs. He pitched sideways. His hand slammed into the cup. It tipped, fell, and clattered loudly against the floorboards, water splashing across the dusty wood and soaking into his blanket. Colm froze his chest, heaving, his face burning with a sudden violent heat. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the lecture. He waited for her to scream at him about how tired she was, about how she had to clean up his messes, about how useless he was. He braced himself for the cruelty he knew was coming. Martha opened her eyes. She looked at the overturned cup. She looked at the water soaking into the wood. Then she looked at Colm, who was rigid, defensive, and completely stripped of his pride. She didn't yell. She didn't sigh theatrically. She just slowly pushed herself up from the rocking chair, her knees popping loudly in the quiet room. She walked to the kitchen, fetched a dry rag, and walked back. She knelt beside the cot, the fabric of her dress pulling tight across her broad hips. She soaked up the water in silence, wringing the rag into the bucket. "I tried to reach it." Colm rasped, his voice defensive, almost a growl. Martha paused. She looked at his large hands clutching the edge of the blanket. "I know," she said quietly. She stood up, took the cup, and refilled it from the pitcher on the counter. She walked back and held it out to him. Colm hesitated, then took at his knuckles, brushing hers. Her skin was rough, calloused, and warm. "You spill that one, you're licking it off the floor," she said, her tone perfectly flat. Colm took a sip. For the first time since Amos dragged him out of that wagon, the hard, defensive line of his mouth broke. A faint, almost imperceptible huff of amusement escaped his nose. Fair enough," he muttered. Martha sat back down in the rocker. She didn't look at him with a soft gaze, and he didn't offer a charming smile. But as the rain lashed against the siding of the small house, the silence between them was no longer filled with barbed wire. It was just quiet. Two heavy, imperfect survivors finally realizing they were in the same storm. By late September, the high plains shed their brutal heat, replacing it with a biting, relentless wind that whistled through the gaps in the floorboards. The mornings were laced with frost, stiffening the dead grass and freezing the water in the pump. For Martha, the cold was a different kind of enemy. It settled deep into her joints, making her knees scream every time she carried a load of firewood from the shed to the porch. She was losing ground. The harvest, what little there was of it, needed to be brought in. The root cellar organized the roof patched before the snow flew. She did the work of 3 men, her thick body moving with a stubborn, plodding determination, but it was wearing her down to the bone. Colm watched it all from his iron cot, which Martha had eventually pushed near the pot-belly stove so he wouldn't freeze. He had begun to sit up for longer periods, bracing his massive shoulders against the wall. The fever had completely left him, and the hollowed-out look in his cheeks was slowly filling in, thanks to Martha's heavy, starchy stews. But as his strength returned, so did a gnawing, suffocating restlessness. He was a man who had lived his entire life in motion. He had tracked elk across the jagged teeth of the Rockies, hauled traps through freezing rivers, and built cabins with his bare hands. Now he was a lump of dead weight, entirely dependent on a woman who was killing herself to keep them both alive. The humiliation tasted like copper in the back of his throat. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday evening. Martha came inside, her face ruddy from the wind, dragging the heavy leather harness of her only mule. The main trace had snapped. Without it, she couldn't drag the fallen deadwood from the creek bed to chop for winter fuel. She dropped the harness on the floor with a heavy thud, stripped off her coat, and sank into the rocking chair. She didn't speak. She just fetched her late husband's leatherworking kit, a roll of cracked canvas, holding an all-thick waxed thread and a rusted punch. She dragged the heavy leather into her lap and set to work. Colum watched her from the shadows. Her fingers, though thick and strong, were clumsy with the fine work. The leather was old, stiff as oak board, and fighting her at every turn. She pushed the awl against the thick hide, her jaw clenched, a bead of sweat tracing down the side of her face, despite the chill in the room. The awl slipped. The sharp metal tip gouged a deep, bloody line across the fleshy pad of her thumb. Martha hissed, dropping the tool. She pressed her thumb against her apron, the rough fabric quickly blooming with a dark red spot. She squeezed her eyes shut, and for the first time Colum saw the rigid line of her shoulders tremble. It wasn't pain. It was the overwhelming, crushing exhaustion of fighting a war she was destined to lose. "Bring it here," Colum said. His voice broke the heavy silence, gruff and unpolished. Martha opened her eyes, glaring at him across the dimly lit room. She cradled her bleeding hand against her chest. "I don't have time for your barking tonight, mountain man. I have to fix this, or we freeze in December." I said, "Bring it here." Colum leaned forward, the muscles in his neck cording. "You don't know how to stitch a working trace. You're pulling the thread too tight, tearing the hide, and your awl is duller than a river stone." Martha stared at him, her chest heaving. She looked at the bloody tear in her thumb, then down at the ruined leather. Pride told her to tell him to go to hell. Pragmatism, however, was a harsh mistress. She stood, picked up the harness and the canvas roll, and dropped the whole tangled mess onto his lap. "Fine," she snapped. "Do it. Show me how useless I am." Colum ignored her tone. He picked up the awl, turning it over in his calloused hands. "Wet stone," he demanded. Martha fetched the stone from the kitchen block. She handed it to him, then stood back, crossing her arms over her chest, watching defensively. Colum didn't look at her. He spat on the stone and began to work the edge of the awl. The rhythmic shk-shk of steel on stone filled the room. His hands moved with a practiced, fluid grace that his legs would never possess again. It was the muscle memory of 1,000 nights spent mending gear by a lonely campfire. Once the tool was sharp, he picked up the stiff, unyielding leather. Where Martha had struggled to hold it, Colum's massive forearms easily bent the thick hide into submission. He punched the holes with precise, measured force. He threaded the needle with the waxed cord, his thick fingers moving with surprising dexterity. He stitched a double line, locking the knots deep into the grain of the leather, where they wouldn't chafe the mule's hide. Martha watched him. The scent of raw, leather-old tallow and wood smoke hung heavy in the air. She noticed the intense focus in his pale blue eyes, the way his jaw relaxed when his hands were busy. He wasn't a broken thing right now. He was a craftsman in his element. It took him an hour. When he was done, he bit the heavy cord, snapping it with his teeth. He tossed the repaired harness onto the floorboards. The seam was flawless, tighter and stronger than the original factory stitching. "There!" Colum rasped, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Martha picked up the trace. She pulled at the joint with all her strength. It didn't budge. It was solid. She traced her thumb over the neat row of stitches. She looked at Colum. He was waiting for a thank you, or perhaps a begrudging compliment. "The mule collar has a tear in the lining, too," Martha said flatly, her voice giving nothing away. "I'll bring it in tomorrow. Don't think you're sleeping all day." Colum stared at her, then let out a low, rough sound that might have been a laugh. He leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms. "Bring the saddle soap, too," he replied. "This place smells like a wet dog, and your tack is a disgrace." Martha walked toward the kitchen to bandage her thumb. She didn't smile, but the crushing weight in her chest had lightened just a fraction. For the first time in months, she wasn't carrying the entire farm alone. November hit the plains like a swinging hammer. The sky turned a bruised, permanent grey, and the wind carried the sharp, metallic smell of impending snow. Martha had rigged a sturdy wooden chair with wheels salvaged from a rusted-out wheelbarrow. It was ugly heavy and groaned loudly, but it allowed Colum to move himself out of the parlour. Using his powerful arms, he could wheel himself to the porch, where he spent his days sharpening tools, repairing tack, and chopping the stove wood Martha hauled up to him. He was a silent, brooding presence, but the sharp edges of his anger had dulled into a focused utility. It was mid-morning when the wagon crested the hill. The crunch of the iron wheels on the frozen ruts was loud in the crisp air. Martha was out near the chicken coop, tossing cracked corn to the hens, her breath pluming in white clouds. She stopped, leaning heavily on the wooden handle of her bucket. It was Amos. He pulled the mules to a halt near the house, a thick buffalo coat swallowing his thin frame. 2 other men rode on horseback behind him, members of the town council who had voted to dump Colum at her door. They sat their horses looking around the property with a mixture of surprise and disappointment. They expected ruin. They expected to find the widow starved out and the mountain man rotting in his own filth. Instead, the woodpile was stacked 10 feet high and perfectly square. The roof of the barn was patched, and the porch was swept clean. Amos climbed down his boots, crunching on the frosted grass. He spat his dark tobacco juice onto the frozen earth. "Well now," Amos sneered, walking toward Martha. "You're still breathing, Martha, and looking as well-fed as ever. I told the council you'd have eaten the cripple by now." The 2 men on horseback chuckled. Martha didn't flinch. She gripped the bucket, her knuckles turning white. She could feel the heat rising in her face, the familiar shame and anger that Amos always managed to draw out of her. "What do you want, Amos?" she asked, her voice tight. "You're trespassing." "Trespassing." Amos laughed, stepping closer. The smell of unwashed wool and sour mash whiskey rolled off him. "Technically, you owe the bank for the back taxes. The deadline is tomorrow. We figured you wouldn't have the coin, so we came to do an inventory. See what we can auction off to cover your debts." Martha felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. The harvest had been terrible. She barely had enough to survive the winter, let alone pay taxes. She looked around her farm, the dirt, the struggle, the endless labor. It was all she had. "I have until tomorrow," Martha said, stepping forward, using her size to block his path to the barn. "Get off my land." Amos sneered. He reached out and shoved her shoulder. It wasn't a hard push, but the ground was slick with frost. Martha's heavy boots slipped, and she stumbled backward, dropping the bucket. The corn scattered across the frozen dirt. "Don't get uppity, fat girl," Amos hissed. "You're a squatter now. We'll take the mule, the tools, and whatever else is worth a damn." He took another step towards her. Thwack. The sound was sudden and violently loud. A heavy bone-handled hunting knife buried itself into the wooden post of the chicken coop, vibrating furiously. The blade was exactly 2 inches from Amos's nose. Amos froze his eyes, crossing slightly to look at the gleaming steel. The 2 men on horseback instinctively reached for their sidearms, their horses dancing nervously. "You take another step toward her, and the next one goes through your throat." The voice was a low, guttural rumble that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. Amos slowly turned his head. Sitting on the porch, shadowed by the overhanging roof, was Colum. He was leaning forward in his makeshift chair. A heavy Sharps rifle rested casually across his lap, his finger resting lightly near the trigger guard. He held a second throwing knife in his left hand, the blade catching the dull grey light. He didn't look like a crippled dependent. He looked like the apex predator of the high timber, cornered and deadly. His pale eyes were locked onto Amos with a terrifying, vacant calm. There was no bluff in his stare. It was the look of a man who had killed before and was merely calculating the wind resistance for the next throw. "You," Ima stammered, taking a step back from the vibrating knife. "You're supposed to be dead." "Not yet," Colum rasped. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Pick up the bucket, Amos." Ima swallowed hard, looking at the two men on horseback for support. They were completely still, their hands frozen above their holsters, having calculated that the mountain man could put a hole through one of them before they could draw. "I ain't picking up no bucket for a dead-legged freak." Ima spat, trying to salvage his pride, though his voice trembled. Colum slowly raised the heavy barrel of the Sharp's rifle, the metal scraping against the wooden armrest of his chair. He cocked the hammer. The mechanical click-clack was deafening in the cold air. "Pick up the bucket." Colum repeated his voice barely above a whisper. "Fill it with the corn you spilled, or I will blow your leg off and let Martha use it to beat you to death." The silence stretched taut as a piano wire. Then with a jerky, humiliated movement, Amos bent down. He grabbed the tin bucket. His hands shook as he scooped up the spilled corn, scraping his freezing fingers against the hard dirt. He stood up, dropping the bucket near Martha's feet. "We'll be back tomorrow," Amos muttered, refusing to look at Colum. "With the sheriff. You don't have the money." He scrambled back into his wagon. The two riders wheeled their horses around, eager to put distance between themselves and the man on the porch. Amos whipped the mules, and the wagon rattled aggressively down the drive, disappearing back toward Red Creek. Martha stood in the yard, her chest heaving, her breath pluming. She looked at the bucket of dirty corn, then up at the porch. Colum uncocked the rifle and set it down. He leaned back in his chair, the fierce, terrifying energy draining from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very tired. The phantom pain in his severed spine was radiating upward, making his hands shake slightly as he put the second knife away. Martha walked slowly to the coop, gripped the handle of the knife buried in the post, and yanked it free with a grunt. She wiped the blade on her apron and walked to the porch. She stopped at the base of the stairs, looking up at him. She didn't thank him. Thank you was too small a word, too polite, for what had just happened. She held the knife-out handle first. Colum took it, sliding it into the sheath strapped to his chair. "He's right," Colum said quietly, staring out at the frozen plains. "They'll come back tomorrow." Martha walked up the steps, her boots heavy on the wood. She stood beside him, looking out at the same bleak horizon. "Then we figure it out," she said. She didn't look down at him with pity, and he didn't look up at her with shame. The cold wind howled around the farmhouse, but on the porch a quiet, unbreakable iron had settled between them. The kerosene lamp on the kitchen table sputtered, throwing long, greasy shadows against the log walls. The smell of burning oil was sharp and metallic, mixing with the stale scent of boiled chicory root. Martha sat hunched over a torn square of brown butcher paper, a dull nub of a pencil gripped tightly in her thick fingers. She scratched out another number. Her chest felt hollow. She had inventoried everything. If she sold the mule, she couldn't haul wood. If she sold the plow, she couldn't plant in the spring. If she sold the seed corn, there would be no spring at all. The bank's tax assessment lay flat on the table, a crisp white death warrant for the farm. She stared at the numbers until her vision blurred, the chronic ache in her lower back, throbbing in time with her pulse. From the shadows of the parlor, the creak of the makeshift wheelchair broke the silence. Colum rolled himself into the doorway. The cast-iron wheels ground against the floorboards. "Stop wearing holes in the paper," Colum said. His voice was rough from disuse, scraping the quiet of the room. "You can't math your way out of an empty pocket." Martha didn't look up. "Go to sleep, mountain man. I don't need your philosophy tonight." "Bring me my coat." Martha finally stopped writing. She turned her head, the bags under her eyes, dark and heavy in the yellow light. "Your buckskin, it's in the rag barrel. I boiled it in lye 3 times, and it still smells like bear grease and dried blood." "Bring it here." he repeated, holding her gaze. Martha pushed herself up from the chair with a heavy sigh, her knees popping. She dragged her feet to the corner of the kitchen, dug into the wooden barrel, and pulled out the stiff, ruined hide. She tossed it onto Colum's lap. It hit his dead legs with a dull slap. Colum drew his skinning knife. The blade slid from its sheath with a soft, metallic whisper. Martha stiffened her hands, dropping to her sides. But Colum didn't look at her. He flipped the heavy coat over, exposing the thick, double-layered leather of the collar. He wedged the tip of the knife under the heavy sinew stitching and sliced downward in one brutal, fluid motion. The tough hide parted. He dug his thick fingers into the gap and pulled. A small, dark pouch made of oiled pigskin fell onto his lap. He picked it up, untied the leather cord, and upended it over his palm. 3 heavy, irregular lumps of raw, unrefined gold tumbled out, gleaming dully in the lamplight. They were the size of walnuts. Martha stared at the gold. She didn't gasp. She didn't weep with relief. Instead, a hot, ugly flush of anger crawled up her thick neck, turning her face dark red. "You had that—" She breathed, her voice trembling with a sudden violent rage. "You had that sewn into your coat this whole time, while I fed you my own rations, while I dragged a plough by myself because the mule was lame. You let me bleed." Colum didn't flinch. He looked down at the gold, then back up at her angry, flushed face. "I was paralyzed, Martha," he said, his tone utterly devoid of apology. "I was a dead man dumped in a stranger's dirt. If I showed you this on day 1, you could have taken it, dragged me out back, and left me for the coyotes. Or paid Amos to do it. Up in the timber, you don't show your cash to a wolf until you know it ain't going to bite your throat." Martha took a step forward, her heavy chest heaving. "I wiped your ass. I fed you. I didn't leave you to die." "I know," Colum said quietly. He held out his hand, the gold resting in his scarred palm. "That's why you're getting it now. Room and board. Pay the tax man. Keep the change." Martha looked at his hand. The anger was still there, a hot knot in her chest, but she understood him. He was an animal who had been trapped, terrified, and broken. Trust wasn't a given. It was a currency he couldn't afford to spend foolishly. She reached out and snatched the pouch, snatching the nuggets from his palm. Her rough fingers brushed his. "I'm charging you interest," she snapped, turning her back to him so he couldn't see the sudden, traitorous sheen of tears in her eyes. The next morning the frost was thick enough to mimic a light snow. Amos arrived in a rented buggy wrapped in a thick wool blanket, a triumphant sneer plastered across his face. Beside him rode the county sheriff, a bored-looking man with a red nose and a Winchester resting across his saddle pommel. Martha stood on the porch, her arms crossed tight against the biting cold. Colum was nowhere to be seen. He had rolled his chair into the shadows of the parlor, a loaded rifle resting across his dead legs, watching through the crack in the door. Amos didn't bother getting out of the buggy. "Morning, Martha. Sheriff's here for the deed. Or the inventory. Your pick." Martha walked down the wooden steps, her heavy boots crunching on the frozen earth. She reached into the pocket of her apron, pulled out one of the raw gold nuggets, and tossed it. It hit Amos square in the chest, dropping into his lap, with a heavy, undeniable thud. Amos scrambled to pick it up, his sneer evaporating into a mask of pure shock. He held the gold up to the grey morning light. The sheriff leaned over his saddle, his eyes widening. "That's for the taxes," Martha said, her voice carrying across the freezing yard like the crack of a whip. "The assayer in town will weigh it. It'll cover this year, next year, and whatever phantom late fees you tried to invent. If there's change, keep it. Consider it a fee to never drive your wagon up my road again." Amos opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked from the gold to Martha, completely unmoored. "We're squared, Amos," the sheriff grunted, tipping his hat to Martha. "Have a good winter, Mrs. Higgins." Amos swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he clutched the nugget. He shot one last venomous look at the dark windows of the farmhouse, whipped the reins, and drove away. Martha stood in the yard watching them go. The wind bit at her cheeks, but for the first time in 3 years, she didn't feel the crushing weight of the sky pressing down on her shoulders. She turned and walked back up the stairs. By late January, the plains were buried beneath 3 feet of hard-packed snow. The wind screamed over the roofline of the farmhouse in a continuous, deafening howl, rattling the window frames and driving fine white powder through the cracks in the siding. Inside, the world had shrunk to a 20-foot square of heat smells and shared breath. The pot-belly stove roared, radiating a dry, suffocating heat. The small house smelled intensely of rendering lard damp wool and the sharp tang of wood smoke. Survival had forced Martha and Colum into an orbit so tight they could barely breathe without shifting the air around the other. Colum had adapted. He had bolted a series of heavy iron pulleys to the ceiling beams, running thick hemp ropes down to his cot and his chair. Using his massive upper body strength, he could now haul himself from the bed to the chair without Martha's help. It was a brutal, sweaty process that left his shoulders trembling, but he refused to let her lift him anymore. Martha spent her days processing the butchered hog she had managed to slaughter right before the freeze. The work was endless, greasy, and exhausting. It was a Tuesday night, the storm raging outside with fresh fury. Martha stood near the stove, a tin basin of hot water resting on a wooden crate. She was exhausted. Her bones felt like lead. She turned her back to the room, assuming Colum was asleep on his cot. She unbuttoned the front of her heavy calico dress, letting the bodice slip down to her waist. Her thick white shoulders were flushed red from the heat of the stove. She dipped a rough linen rag into the hot water, wrung it out, and dragged it across the back of her neck. She let out a long, shuddering sigh as the heat seeped into her aching muscles. She scrubbed under her heavy breasts over the thick rolls of her stomach, making no attempt to be delicate. She despised her body. Her late husband, Armis's brother, had spent 10 years reminding her that she was built like a draft horse, too wide, too heavy, entirely lacking the soft fragility that men supposedly desired. She scrubbed the soap against her skin with a punishing rhythm, trying to wash away the smell of hog fat and exhaustion. The soap slipped from her wet fingers. It hit the floorboards and slid under the iron edge of Colum's cot. Martha groaned a sound of pure defeat. She bent down her heavy thighs, straining against the fabric of her skirt, reaching blindly under the bed. "You're going to pull a muscle in your back doing that." The low, gravelly voice made Martha freeze. She snapped upright, clutching the wet rag to her chest, her face burning hotter than the stove. Colum was awake. He was propped up on one elbow, the blanket pooled at his waist, his bare chest scarred and corded with muscle. He reached down his long arm, easily retrieving the soap from the floor. He didn't hand it to her immediately. He just looked at her. Martha felt entirely exposed. She was sweating half-dressed, her hair a frizzy, damp mess. She wanted to sink through the floorboards. She crossed her thick arms over her chest defensively, her chin jutting out in a familiar posture of defiance. "Close your eyes, mountain man." She snapped, her voice trembling slightly. "It ain't a picture show." Colum didn't look away. His pale blue eyes tracked over her broad shoulders, the thick curve of her waist, the solid, unyielding reality of her presence. There was no disgust in his gaze. There was no mocking humor. "You fight your own shadow, Martha," Colum said quietly. He held out the soap. Martha hesitated, then took a step forward, grabbing the soap from his hand. She tried to step back, but Colum's thick, calloused fingers caught her wrist. His grip was entirely firm, a band of hot iron against her damp skin. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Let go of me," she said, though the command lacked its usual bite. "He told you that you were ugly, didn't he?" Colum asked, his thumb lightly brushing the heavy pulse point at her wrist. "Your husband?" Martha's throat tightened. The raw honesty of the question stripped away her defenses. "He told me I was built for pulling stumps, not for looking at—" she whispered, the old shame souring on her tongue. Colum let out a low, derisive snort. A weak man always resents a strong horse. He tugged gently on her wrist, forcing her to take half a step closer to the cot. The heat radiating off his skin mixed with the heat of the stove. Down in the settlements, they like their women fragile. Colum murmured, his voice a dark rumble in the quiet cabin. They like things that break easily. Up in the timber, fragile gets you killed. You survive. You hold the roof up. He released her wrist and moved his hand upward, his rough palm cupping the heavy curve of her hip through the damp fabric of her dress. It wasn't a tentative romantic touch. It was a claiming of weight, a recognition of her physical reality. There ain't nothing ugly about a woman who can hold her ground, Colum said, looking up into her eyes. Martha stared down at him, her chest rising and falling heavily. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel oversized or clumsy. She felt like an anchor. She felt like the earth itself. She let the wet rag drop from her hand. It hit the floor with a soft slap, lost to the roaring of the wind outside. The morning after the soap fell, the air in the cabin was thick with an unspoken, heavy awkwardness. Martha woke before the sun as always. She dressed in the freezing dark of the kitchen, her thick fingers fumbling with the stiff bone buttons of her wool dress. She didn't look toward the parlor. She could hear the slow, rhythmic rasp of Colum's breathing, a sound that had somehow become the metronome of her own life. Her skin still hummed where his calloused palm had rested against her hip. It felt like a phantom burn. She shoved the memory down, drowning it in the immediate, grounding noise of violently shaking the iron grates of the stove and shoveling in fresh coal. She expected him to say something when he finally hauled himself into his chair. A smirk, a comment, a retreat into his usual brooding silence. Instead, he simply wheeled himself to the kitchen table, picked up his tin cup, and waited for the coffee to boil. They didn't speak of it. They didn't have the luxury of dissecting emotions when the snow was piled to the eaves and the wind was screaming a murder ballad against the glass. But the silence between them had shifted. It was no longer the wary stillness of two trapped animals. It was a shared bunker. By late February, the snow stopped falling, but the danger multiplied. A sudden, cruel spike in temperature brought a heavy, freezing rain, adding hundreds of pounds of dense, wet ice to the roof. It started as a low, agonizing groan. Martha was at the table kneading a tough ball of sourdough. Colum was sharpening a skinning knife by the stove. The sound made them both freeze. It wasn't the wind. It was the deep structural protest of old timber reaching its breaking point. Crack, the noise was sharp as a gunshot. A fine dusting of sawdust and dried bark drifted down from the ceiling, landing softly on the kitchen table. Martha snapped her head up. The main load-bearing beam, a massive span of stripped pine that ran the length of the parlor, was bowing downward. Right in the center, a jagged black splinter had opened in the wood. The weight of the ice was snapping the house in half. "Get away from the table!" Colum barked, his voice cracking like a whip. Martha didn't argue. She backed away, wiping flour on her apron. Another sickening groan ripped through the room. The beam dipped another inch. The window frames shrieked as the walls took the displaced weight. "It's going to cave." Martha breathed, the color draining from her round face. If the roof fell, they wouldn't die of the impact. They would freeze to death in the ruins before morning. "The root cellar." Colum ordered, his eyes frantically scanning the ceiling. "There's a 6x6 oak post down there. We use it to brace the floorboards. Fetch it." Martha ran. She threw open the heavy trap door in the kitchen, practically throwing herself down the narrow wooden stairs into the freezing, earthy dark of the cellar. She found the heavy oak timber buried under a pile of empty burlap sacks. It was dense, freezing cold, and weighed 100 pounds. She hauled it up the stairs with a guttural scream of exertion, the rough bark tearing the skin off her knuckles. She dragged it across the kitchen floor, her chest heaving, sweat instantly beading on her forehead. "Here!" she gasped, rolling it toward Colum. "Stand it up," he said, wheeling his chair directly under the splintering fracture in the beam. "I'll guide the top, you wedge the bottom. Column if it snaps while you're under it. Stand it up, Martha." She gripped the heavy post, planted her boots, and deadlifted the wood. Her heavy shoulders screamed in protest. She walked it upright, her thick thighs trembling under the immense weight. Colum reached up, his massive arms corded with the muscle, built from months of hauling his own dead weight clamped around the rough oak. "Push it!" He grunted, his teeth bared in a grimace of pure strain. Martha threw her entire body weight against the bottom of the post, sliding it across the floorboards until it was directly under the fracture. But it was 2 inches too short to touch the sagging beam. "It needs a wedge," Colum yelled over another terrifying crack from the ceiling. He was holding the heavy post vertical, his biceps bulging, his face flushed dark red. Martha scrambled to the woodpile near the stove. She grabbed a thick wedge of split hickory and the heavy iron maul she used for splitting kindling. She threw herself onto her knees beside Colum's chair. "Lift it," she yelled. Colum didn't argue. He wrapped his arms around the oak post, took a deep, ragged breath, and pushed upward. He wasn't just lifting the post, he was trying to push the ceiling of the house back into place. The veins in his neck stood out like thick blue ropes. A raw animal roar ripped from his throat as he forced the heavy beam upward by a fraction of an inch. Martha didn't hesitate. She shoved the hickory wedge under the base of the post and swung the iron maul. Clang! The hammer hit the wedge. The post tightened against the ceiling. Colum held the weight, his arms violently shaking the leather grips of his wheelchair, groaning as his dead legs were pushed downward by the counter-pressure. Clang! Martha swung again, driving the wedge deeper. The splintering sound stopped. The beam settled heavily onto the flat top of the oak post. Colum let go, his arms dropping like lead weights. He slumped back in his chair, gasping for air, his chest heaving violently. Martha dropped the maul. She stayed on her knees, leaning her forehead against the rough bark of the braced post, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The house was silent, save for the wind outside. The beam held. Martha slowly turned her head. Colum was looking at her, his face pale sweat dripping from his jaw. The space between them was entirely gone. She reached out her hand, shaking, and pressed her bleeding knuckles against the rough wool of his trousers, right over his dead knee. She didn't say a word. She just anchored herself to him. Colum covered her hand with his grip tight, calloused, and unyielding. They sat there in the cold, holding up the roof together. The thaw came in April, and it was a violent, ugly resurrection. The snow didn't melt gracefully. It rotted. The pristine white fields turned into a sucking, treacherous bog of black mud and standing water. The air smelled of wet earth, decomposing grass, and raw sunlight. The creeks swelled over their banks, roaring with a muddy fury that tore out the dead wood and dragged it downstream. For the first time in 5 months, the door to the farmhouse stayed open. Martha stood on the porch, a tin cup of water in her hand, squinting against the blinding glare of the sun reflecting off the puddles. She was thinner. The winter had burned away some of her bulk, leaving her shoulders harder, her jawline more pronounced, but she was still a heavy, formidable woman. She watched the field. 50 yards away, Colum was in the mud. He wasn't in his wheelchair. The iron wheels would have sunk to the axles in the muck. Instead, he had engineered a low, flat sled made from smooth pine boards curved at the front like a toboggan. He was strapped to it at the waist, his useless legs resting flat behind him. He was clearing the lower 40. Using his hands wrapped in thick leather rags, he dragged himself across the field. He moved like a wounded bear, slow, deliberate, and undeniably powerful. He reached a massive, half-buried fieldstone that the frost heaves had pushed up during the winter. Martha watched as he dug his hands into the freezing mud, chaining a heavy iron chain around the base of the rock. He didn't ask for the mule. The mule would break an ankle in this mud. Colum gripped the other end of the chain, dug his elbows into the dirt, braced his massive torso, and pulled. The mud sucked at the rock, a loud, wet squelch echoing across the field. Colum grunted his back, arching the muscles in his arms, pulling taut under his sweat-soaked flannel shirt. The rock shifted. He pulled again, letting out a sharp hiss of breath. The stone tore free from the earth. Colum dragged it onto his sled, untied the chain, and began to pull himself toward the rock pile at the edge of the property. He was covered in black mud. His face was smeared with it, his clothes soaked through. He looked entirely wild. Martha walked down the porch steps. Her boots immediately sank 2 inches into the muck. She didn't care. She walked out into the field, the hem of her dress dragging in the wet dirt, soaking up the freezing water. Colum stopped as she approached. He dropped his chin to his chest, panting heavily, his breath pluming slightly in the cool spring air. He looked up at her, wiping a streak of mud from his forehead with the back of a filthy wrist. "You're making a mess of your dress, Martha." He rasped a faint, exhausted smirk, playing at the corner of his mouth. Martha handed him the tin cup. "And you're making a spectacle of yourself, mountain man. You keep pulling rocks like that, you're going to tear a shoulder out of the socket." Colum took the cup and drained it in one long swallow. He handed it back, his fingers brushing hers. The dirt on his skin was gritty and cold. "Better my shoulder than your back. The ground needs turning. We have seed to put down." He said we. He didn't say you. Martha looked out toward the road. A wagon was passing by, a rare sight so early in the season. She recognized the outline of Amos Higgins on the buckboard. He had slowed the mules, staring openly at the field. He was looking at the fat widow and the crippled mountain man working the deep mud like a pair of draft animals. Amos didn't stop. He didn't yell an insult. He just whipped the mules and hurried down the road looking entirely spooked. "He thought we'd be dead," Martha said quietly, watching the wagon disappear over the ridge. "People like him always think the winter will do their killing for them." Colum replied. He unhooked the water canteen from the side of his sled. "They forget that the cold kills the weak things, not the stubborn ones." Martha looked down at him. He was a ruined man by any civilized standard. His legs were dead weight, his clothes were rags, and he was dragging himself through the dirt. But as the spring sun hit his face, highlighting the hard, uncompromising lines of his jaw and the fierce intelligence in his pale eyes, she realized he was the most magnificent thing she had ever seen. He didn't look at her with the resentful, shrinking eyes of her late husband. He looked at her as an equal, a partner in the dirt. Martha knelt in the mud. She didn't care about the cold water seeping through her thick wool stockings. She grabbed the heavy chain attached to the rock on his sled. "What are you doing?" Colum asked, his brow furrowing. "You pull the sled." Martha said, her voice entirely steady. "I'll pull the chain. We'll move it twice as fast. The sun's wasting." Colum stared at her. The wind caught a stray lock of her damp hair, whipping it across her round, mud-flecked cheek. A slow, genuine smile finally broke across his face. It didn't reach his eyes with warmth, but rather with a profound, terrifying respect. "All right, Martha," he said, digging his elbows back into the mud. "Pull." They worked until the sun dipped below the horizon, turning the sky a bruised purple. They didn't speak. The only sounds were the squelch of the mud, the heavy clinking of iron chains, and the synchronized, ragged breathing of 2 imperfect survivors, refusing to surrender an inch of their land. October arrived with a sharp, cloudless brilliance that turned the prairie grass into a sea of brittle gold. The morning air carried the sharp scent of wood smoke and the dusty, dry odor of cured corn stalks. The heavy freight wagon groaned under its own weight, the iron-rimmed wheels cutting deep, parallel ruts into the hard-packed dirt road leading into Red Creek. It was loaded high. Burlap sacks of winter wheat crates of hard-rind squash and thick bundles of cured tobacco leaves were stacked with a brutal mathematical precision. Martha sat on the right side of the buckboard. She wore a new dress of dark brown wool, heavy and unadorned the fabric, stretching comfortably over her broad shoulders and thick waist. She held the leather reins in hands that were permanently stained with soil and calloused like tree bark. Beside her sat Colum. He didn't ride in the back like cargo. He had spent 2 weeks in August modifying the wagon seat, bolting a heavy iron frame and a thick leather harness to the wooden bench. It held his massive torso perfectly upright. He wore a clean oilcloth coat, his pale blue eyes tracking the horizon from beneath the wide brim of a worn Stetson. He looked huge. He looked immovable. They crossed the wooden bridge at the edge of town, the hollow thump-thump of the mules' hooves echoing against the dry creek bed. Red Creek had not changed. The false front buildings still leaned against the relentless wind, and the boardwalks were still warped by the summer sun. But as Martha's wagon rolled down the center of the muddy street, a profound, heavy silence rolled out ahead of them. Men on the boardwalk stopped chewing their tobacco. Women stepping out of the mercantile paused, their hands hovering over their woven baskets. They remembered the joke. They remembered the paralyzed, rotting mountain man they had dumped into the wagon of the fat, struggling widow over a year ago. They had expected a double funeral by the spring thaw. Instead, they were looking at a fortress on wheels. Martha pulled the mules to a halt in front of the assayer's office and the general store. The brake lever squealed a harsh sound that made a few townspeople flinch. Amos Higgins was sitting on a barrel outside the saloon across the street. He looked thinner, his face flushed with cheap whiskey, his clothes hanging off his bony frame. He stared at the wagon, his jaw slack. He looked from the towering pile of premium crops to the terrifying straight-backed posture of the mountain man he had dragged by the collar. Colum didn't sneer at Amos. He didn't even look at him. To Colum, Amos was just wind-moving dust, completely irrelevant. The proprietor of the general store, a balding man named Miller, stepped out onto the boardwalk, wiping his hands nervously on his apron. He looked up at Martha, then flicked his eyes to Colum, swallowing hard. "Morning, Mrs. Higgins." Miller said, his voice entirely lacking its usual condescension. That's a mighty heavy load you got there." "It's winter surplus." Martha said, her voice carrying the flat, resonant authority of a woman who had pulled stones from freezing mud. 300 weight of wheat, 50 squash, and tobacco that didn't rot in the field. I want silver for it, Miller, not banknotes, not store credit." Miller nodded quickly, stepping down into the dirt to inspect the wheat. He untied a burlap sack, plunging his hand into the grain. When he pulled it out, his eyes widened. It was perfectly dry, golden, and clean of chaff. "I'll get the scales," Miller muttered, practically running back inside. It took an hour to unload. The town watched in morbid fascination as Martha hoisted the heavy sacks over her shoulder, her thick legs planting firmly in the dirt, her breath steady. Colum managed the inventory from the seat, his deep, rumbling voice barking out weights and tallies, demanding a fair count down to the last ounce. When a young farmhand tried to reach up and adjust Colum's harness, thinking he was stuck, Colum's thick hand shot out, wrapping around the boy's wrist with the speed of a striking snake. "I'm seated fine, son," Colum rasped, releasing the boy, who scrambled backward in terror. When the transaction was done, Martha climbed back onto the buckboard. A heavy canvas pouch of silver coins dropped onto her lap with a deeply satisfying thud. She didn't smile. She just released the brake and clicked her tongue at the mules. The wagon slowly turned around, leaving Red Creek in a stunned, humiliated silence. They didn't speak on the ride back. The sun began to set, bleeding bruised purples and deep oranges across the sprawling, indifferent plains. The evening air turned sharply cold. When they reached the farmhouse, the shadows were long. Martha unhitched the mules, her muscles screaming with the familiar, dull ache of a day's brutal labor. She walked up to the porch, where Colum had already lowered himself into his iron-wheeled chair, using his ceiling pulleys. Martha sank heavily onto the wooden steps, resting her elbows on her thick knees. She pulled the canvas pouch from her pocket and dropped it onto the floorboards between them. "That buys the seed for next year," Martha said quietly, staring out at the dark fields. "And enough coal to keep the stove burning until April." Colum wheeled his chair closer. The iron wheels squeaked softly. He looked down at the pouch, then looked at the back of Martha's neck, at the stray hairs escaping her tight bun damp with sweat. He reached down. His large, scarred hand didn't offer a gentle caress. Instead, his thick fingers wrapped firmly around the heavy meat of her shoulder, squeezing with a grounded, undeniable pressure. It was the grip of a man anchoring himself to the strongest thing in his world. "We built a good winter, Martha." Colum murmured, his voice a low vibration in the quiet dusk. Martha closed her eyes. She felt the calluses on his palm through the wool of her dress. She didn't feel fat. She didn't feel discarded. She covered his large hand with her own thick fingers, squeezing back, matching his iron grip with her own. "Yes, we did, mountain man," she breathed. They sat on the porch as the night swallowed the plains. Two heavy, scarred things that the world had tried to throw away, perfectly content in the empire of dirt they had conquered together. The West was never tamed by the pretty, the perfect, or the fragile. It was broken by the stubborn, the heavy, and the discarded who simply refused to die. Martha and Colum didn't just survive the town's cruel joke. They buried it under a mountain of grit sweat and raw iron. If this story of an unapologetic, grounded romance struck a chord with you, hit that like button and share it with someone who knows the value of real resilience. Subscribe and ring the bell for more gritty, deeply human stories from the untamed frontier.